This episode of the Farmers Weekly podcast is brought to you by plant breeder KWS.
Farming has not had a record of being central to government policy. There's nothing evident in Manchesterism, whatever that might mean, that suggests any insight into rural areas and rural life and the rural economy. These are things that aren't part of the worldview he has so far expressed.
For better or for worse, what can farming expect from an Andy Burnham government? No murder charges for a farmer who shot an intruder, what you can and can't do when protecting property. And could chickpeas be the break crop that beats the summer heatwave? Welcome to the Farmers Weekly podcast. I'm Johan Tasker.
I'm Louise Impey.
I'm Abby Kay.
And I'm Hugh Broom.
Our top story this week: what does an Andy Burnham government need to do to deliver for farming? As the former mayor of Manchester becomes Prime Minister, will he build bridges with farmers, or will it be more of the same? Lots to talk about, and to discuss all that and more, we're joined by Westminster watcher Jeremy Moody, Secretary and Advisor to the Central Association of Agricultural Valuers. Jeremy, a big change in job for Andy Burnham, Mayor of Manchester 1 month, MP for Makerfield the next, and now Prime Minister. A big change for farming too? What can we expect?
It's certainly a massive change for Andy Burnham. There is not a lot in being the mayor of a major city that will prepare him for the real intensity and range and speed of issues that would come to him as Prime Minister in number 10. And as he comes to grips with defence, with dealing with the tight public finances and balancing tax and spending and the need for growth, an ageing population, climate change, all the other pressures from the international politics of today, he will have a lot to adapt to. And I think we have to wait to see, both as he makes decisions that crystallise how he's taking things forward, but just that learning experience of becoming a Prime Minister, for which he has had very little training.
You mentioned all the things that will be on his agenda. You didn't mention food and farming.
It's one of the things that will be on the agenda, but farming has not had a record of being central to government policy. There's nothing evident in Manchesterism, whatever that might mean, that suggests any insight into rural areas and rural life and the rural economy, even in the north, never mind across the rest of the country. It's a big city, big business, big investor vision, not something that offers much to smaller cities. What does it offer to Lincoln? What does it offer to Redruth? What does it offer to Wisbech? What does it offer to Alston in Cumbria? These are things that aren't part of the worldview he has so far expressed.
In his words, though, he has promised to be a leader for the north, the south, the east and the west. So what does his government have to do to deliver for agriculture and the rural economy?
Probably what it really needs to do is start giving shape to its current policies, rather than start all over again. The business of government seems to be terribly laboured and moving terribly slowly. We have, after 2 years now, established a farming roadmap. We have discovered that it is actually not much more than a series of signposts that do give a clear sense of direction. But listening to the Secretary of State being quizzed on the EFRA committee last week, there seems very little thinking about what might be developed for the roads as you follow those signposts. So spatial targeting next year for SFI 2027. How the evolution of private markets for 2030 might happen, and other areas of policy still are clearly works at best in progress. We hope they are in progress. So to change everything simply sets us back another couple of years, leaving us effectively to the economic changes that are happening with policy even further behind the real world than it is now. So continuity in post, the new Minister for Farming, but the current Secretary of State, rather than having a whole gap in which new ministers who may or may not have any interest in the subject read their way in and then start going forward. This government only has 3 years left at the maximum before the next election, and probably therefore a little less. That's a short period in which to do things, given all the limitations on government and the urgencies of the problems facing it.
There's talk, Jeremy, that he could revisit the inheritance tax issue and he may introduce a land tax. Out of the frying pan into the fire?
Well, it usually is, isn't it? So let's take that step by step. And as suggested earlier, I think we wait to see whoever his chancellor might be. I wouldn't expect him to be revisiting inheritance tax at that level. I think he's going to have quite enough on his plate. It would be a very distinctive step if he did. What he has then moved on to say is that the fashionable and long discussed idea of a land value tax could replace a series of property taxes, council tax, business rates, stamp duty, land tax, and perhaps inheritance tax, though, of course, inheritance tax is a UK-wide tax, and all the other taxes and the land value tax would be England-only based. He's then suggested that might be used to raise and fund a social care programme, which is obviously something he is quite interested in, albeit to date it's been talk rather than recent action. What is a land value tax? Well, it's an idea that's been floating around since at least the 1880s. In some ways, it's a little akin to rates. It says, what is the value of your land without the buildings on it? So what is its potential value? And so what might be its best use? What might the market pay for it for its best use? It was first tried and legislated for in 1910, which made that an interesting and very exciting period because it was then as problematic for rural landowners and farmers as it is now. An enormous political storm around that. That led to the creation of the Country Landowners Association, the CLA, and it also led to the creation of the Valuation Office to do all the valuations. They spent 10 years doing the valuations, at which point Lloyd George, then in a different colour of government, abandoned it. There are technical difficulties in doing it. We want to understand whether it's about ownership or it's about occupation. In some sense, farmland is the easy bit to think about, but at one level you've got the house with a large garden. Is that really to be valued as 2 building plots? You have got places like the City of London or a hospital or whatever. How is the land underneath that to be valued? What is the value of bare land under the gherkin? Who knows? But that's where some of the really big tax issues will fall. All that has got to be valued and put in place and argued over. If it led to a charge, now purely to think of a figure that's in some of the current discussions, if it was a bit under £50 an acre, how does that then bear on rental markets? How does that bear on the economics of farming that has been exempt from rates on its business use land? How does that then follow through? Is there going to be a de minimis exemption, whether for an ordinary building plot for an ordinary house? Does it go further? How does this redistribute values? And you start seeing why all these great proposals for tax reform never get anywhere, because they tear the world up, all the pieces come down, quite a lot of people come out roughly where they were beforehand, the winners keep very quiet, and the losers, like the farming interest before and probably now, will be very, very noisy. It'll all be very difficult. It will need legislation. My thought at the moment is that unless there's really high-level energy in this as an absolute priority, the most we might get in the next 3 years is a consultation, which will get people excited, keep people occupied, and leave it all to a later Parliament.
Jeremy Moody from the Central Association of Agricultural Valuers, thank you very much. Now, Hugh, Louise, we'll have your take on this in just a moment, but we've also got with us this week Farmers Weekly Deputy Editor Abby Kay. Abby, you've covered farming politics for a good number of years now. You live in Salford. You know Manchester really well. You've seen Andy Burnham as mayor. What can we expect from him as Prime Minister?
It's really hard to say, isn't it? Because Burnham is notoriously hard to pin down on policy detail, and he's known for flip-flopping as well, isn't he? For saying one thing and then changing his mind. But on the positive side, he has made noises, hasn't he, that he wants to put rural Britain higher up the government's agenda. He wants to reconnect with rural communities and, you know, make sure that the countryside isn't treated as a kind of peripheral issue. And that's all well and good. It's good to hear those warm noises. So if he does stick to his pledge to listen to farmers, I think he'll quickly realise that you're going to have some serious exemptions for farmland in any land value tax if he does decide to go down that route. It might be that he decides that he just doesn't want to expend the political capital on it. And I think that'll be kind of a key litmus test for him in the early weeks, in the early months, is where is he spending his political capital? Because those are the issues that really matter to him. And it'll be really telling about the kind of rest of his premiership to see what is it that he's doing that he's spending political capital on in those early weeks and months.
Thanks, Abby. Hugh, what's your take on all of this?
Well, look, I can't say anything different to Abby in the sense that there needs to be a plan in place and a vision. And yes, the initial noises from Burnham are, this is the plan, this is the vision. But yeah, without a plan and without strategy, and as we've said, and as Abby's just said, you have got to, whether it's farmers, shopkeepers, landlords, industrialists, people claiming benefits, whoever, you have to listen. You have to make your own choice out, your mind up at the end of it, but you have to consult and you have to listen, because as the sort of Comrade Stalin imposition of the IHT changes the other October showed, if you don't consult and you just say, that's it, this is what's going to be, then you get the kickback that we've had. And it's not just on that. There were various other issues, weren't there, which they've either U-turned on or changed. So listen, consult, but have a plan overall.
And Louise, we were speaking off air earlier. You had a novel idea too when it comes to Andy Burnham and farming.
We're hearing, aren't we, a lot of talk about number 10 North and the fact that you've got to get out into the regions. Well, how about a number 10 rural as well? And then we're all going to be represented properly.
The Farmers Weekly Podcast.
The Farmers Weekly Harvest Update, brought to you by KWS.
Welcome indeed to our Farmers Weekly Harvest Update, and I'm joined by Matt Bull from KWS. Matt, welcome along. Another early one this year, the first combines rolling into barley crops in the 4th week of June. We're a few weeks on from that now. How's it going?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we're coming towards the end of a really positive but long demo season where we've been talking about variety choice for farmers on farm. And in terms of yield perspective, we've had the first results coming in from barleys and oilseed rape so far. And I think, to be fair, the earliest cut crops tend to be those on lighter land where there's slightly less potential. But actually, the barley yields have been surprisingly positive, generally landing between about 7 and 9 tonnes per hectare. Yes, the straw is slightly back. Yes, the grain quality is slightly back. But I think in the grand scheme of things, people have landed relatively well so far.
No such thing as a typical season at the moment, but what should growers be looking for in terms of performance, in terms of yield, and indeed crop quality?
Yeah, I think it's a bit early for a cliche, but no season is the same in farming. And this season, the conversations have been completely different to how they have been in previous years. In terms of quality, it's been a really interesting conversation around the opportunity for premiums from Group 1 through to soft Group 4s as well. And ultimately, from a quality perspective, in 2025, we had that hot, dry period where wheat yields were relatively low and proteins were really high. So we had good availability of Group 1 availability. But actually this year, people have pulled back on fertilisers in some situations. And actually, we're not sure what the Group 1 wheat crop is going to look like. So actually, what we're seeing is potential for higher yields this year. And also with people using potentially slightly less fertiliser, we may see a lower protein crop coming this year.
And going forward, Matt, how should what we're seeing now feed into seed decisions when it comes to autumn drilling?
Yeah, great question. So I think from this coming autumn, we're anticipating another large winter wheat crop. And with that, we need varieties which suit different slots on farm. So we're looking at varieties which can do high performance in first and second wheat situations. We're looking for varieties which can perform across a range of drill dates. And we're also looking for varieties which meet the requirements for different end markets to really maximise profitability on farm for growers. I think KWS Arnie is one of those varieties that fits in with that kind of narrative. So a variety which is Group 2 but feed level yields. It's also looked fantastic from a disease resistance perspective all season, and ultimately it's one of the varieties we've had most positive feedback on this year, and we're expecting a really strong performance with it in harvest 2026.
So KWS Arnie then consistent, resilient and reducing risk, or at least managing risk?
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't think the guidance changes much year to year. We're always suggesting a mix of varieties which are best suited to certain situations on farm to get the best out of them and in turn get the best business result for yourselves.
Matt, thank you very much, and thanks for shedding some light on what's happening in the field this harvest. That's it for this week's Farmers Weekly Harvest Update with KWS. Happy harvesting, and do join us again next time when we'll have another update with Matt Bull from KWS.
That's the Farmers Weekly Harvest Update, brought to you by KWS, seeding the future since 1856.
The Farmers Weekly Podcast.
Now, a farmer arrested on suspicion of murder after shooting a teenage intruder at his property in Derbyshire will face no action, says the Crown Prosecution Service. Rob Lomas was arrested after discharging the firearm during the incident, which happened in the early hours of May the 1st, 2024. He's finally been released from bail after more than 2 years. The CPS says Mr. Lomas will not face any criminal charges in relation to the death of 19-year-old Marcus Smith and serious injuries to another person at the property. Well, joining us now is Aled Owen, a legal expert and agricultural solicitor at law firm HCR Law. Aled, welcome to the Farmers Weekly podcast. A traumatic case for everyone involved, and many farmers listening to this finding themselves victims of crime, of burglary, of theft, living in remote farmhouses will be thinking, there, but for the grace of God, go I.
And I can understand their concern. We're living in a place where they are increasingly isolated, and we have the challenges in relation to the manner in which farmers are often targeted for goods and their valuables, living in a location where without security or the benefit occasions of neighbours nearby to assist them.
Now, one of the reasons, Aled, that the Crown Prosecution Service gave for not charging Mr. Lomas was the householder's right to defend themselves. Just explain that to us, please.
Well, it comes down to two aspects. The use of force, even deadly force, is there if it demands it, but the legal test is applied on necessity, which is the question of honest belief, and reasonableness, also known as proportionality. So dealing with the necessity, the question is, did the person believe the force was necessary to protect themselves, another person, a family member, or to prevent a crime? Now, they judged that in court on an objective basis, and the perspective at the time, even if your belief turns out to be mistaken. The question of reasonableness then is down to the question of the force you apply in that context. Was it reasonable for you to react in the way that you did to the threat you perceived? The law tries its best to recognise in the heat of a terrifying situation that you may respond in a different way, and you can't work and respond forensically in that situation. But the law does get applied in a logical way, which shows that you must not go beyond, according to what a jury and a judge directing a jury would deem to be excessive in order to neutralise the threat. And even then, when applying those two principles, there could be a situation where you could be found to be acting honestly, that you see the threat, but you are grossly excessive to what you've done. And you could have a partial self-defence argument, so the defence isn't lost entirely, and you could be convicted, therefore, of a manslaughter, which would be a lesser offence in that context. So it is a difficult and challenging piece of law to apply. It does allow some ability for farmers and rural property owners to defend themselves in that context, but it is a difficult one to apply on a daily basis when an incident or an issue did arise where the farmer's got to react in the heat of the moment. In this case, they must have been aware of the fact that the farmer must have given a good account of himself. They must have been aware of the context in which the assailant or the intruder came on the property, and the Crown Prosecution Service must have applied the evidential test and potentially the public interest test in those circumstances, and given the farmer the benefit of the doubt in terms of how he applied his mind in relation to what was likely or not a pressing and challenging situation.
This was a firearm that Mr. Lomas held legally, but no farmer is going to want to be in a situation where they feel they have to pull the trigger like this. What would your advice be?
It's difficult for any solicitor to give advice because no situation is equally similar, and every situation is distinct and different. The courts and the police will look as to the credibility of the witnesses, the credibility of the defendant, and in that context, the farmer's view of what may happen may very well be determined by those who may not have knowledge of country matters or rural affairs. So in terms of those kind of issues and how you deal with it, my advice would be to be cautious in never picking up a gun in that situation when an assailant or intruder comes into your home, to think, are there alternatives to deal this in a different way? Are there alternatives that means I can protectively save myself and my family and property? And only in the final set of circumstances, when there are no other options available, having gone through those kind of considerations, when there's deemed to be an equal threat with the other person carrying a weapon or an instrument bound to cause pain to the individual, they respond to that with equal force in that context. The only other piece of advice I would give is, as soon as any incident occurs, to contact the police, to contact solicitor, and contact the local trade union representative, whether that's the National Farmers Union or similar organisation, to get advice and some assistance as soon as possible, which will no doubt be a situation which is bound in legal complexities and matters where there will be a need to address matters in a very forensic, clear, measured, accurate way to ensure the best result for the individual concerned.
Aled Jones, partner at law firm HCR Law. Thank you very much for joining us here on the Farmers Weekly podcast. Hugh, Louise, Abby, I think it's important when we're talking about this to remember that a 19-year-old teenager has died. 2 families' lives have been changed forever. A man has spent 2 years on bail, suspected of murder. I guess the real story here is perhaps why rural people feel so vulnerable, why farmers find themselves in these kind of situations. This is not the first time this has happened.
Yeah, it is. It's an absolutely awful situation for everybody concerned. I think a lot of farmers will be able to relate to that sense of feeling afraid on their farms, even in their houses, because of rural crime, and this case speaks to that wider issue. And I think really the bottom line is it's something that the police and the government need to get a grip on. They need to put more resources in to make sure that criminals are caught and farmers don't ever feel like they have to take matters into their own hands, pull the trigger on a gun. That's the last thing they would ever want to do.
Yes, I think this particular farmer was put in a horrible position, wasn't he? Especially considering that there'd been a break-in at the property the night before as well. So, he was protecting his own property. Unfortunately, it ended the way that it did. But I think it's all been reviewed very carefully by the CPS, and they have decided, not to press charges. So, I'm sure he regrets what happened on that night, but, in the heat of the moment and with his own safety and that of his family to think about, it's not that surprising that these things happen.
Hugh, your thoughts?
Yeah, look, I'd repeat exactly what Abby said. It's a horrendous scenario for everybody involved. I suppose that, the ultimate really is how do you stop it even happening, isn't it? And it's about crime prevention. Some people are always going to want to try and target your property and get into your property and steal your property. What can you do to? We talk, every time we talk about crime prevention, the first thing we talk about is what can I do? I can whinge about the police, I can whinge about the government, I can whinge about whoever, and blame everyone else. But actually, number one, what can I do to protect my property and to minimise the risk and deter people from even thinking that they might want to come onto my property, whether I should or shouldn't have to? is the things I can do to deter them from doing that, whether that's enhanced security, CCTV, fencing, whatever. It's just an awful scenario. But and actually some people will be saying, look, doesn't matter, you can do all of that, but people, if they're minded enough, they're still going to want to come into your property to steal from you. And that's just a sad fact of life, isn't it? But this is a horrendous thing, and I wouldn't wish it on anybody, either of the sides of this particular encounter. It's really tragic. It's just horrible. And we just, I suppose, all of us need to do our bit to try and prevent it where we can, those small moves to prevent crime, to dissuade people from coming from incursions onto our property. And actually I don't know, I mean, one of the things around crime prevention, isn't it? It's just showing that people actually care, where you've got, property or people are actually being questioned and asked, why are you here? And that sort of thing all too often. But it's not easy to do because all too often our lives are so busy. We don't have time to question everybody that might be just casing up our joint or driving by or doing whatever. So it's really tricky, but it comes back to the whole thing of what can we do to avoid it at all, if at all possible, because the whole thing is just horrible.
The Farmers Weekly Podcast. The Farmers Weekly Podcast.
You're listening to the Farmers Weekly Podcast. Welcome along wherever you're listening to us from. You can email us podcast@fwi.co.uk. And if you're in the UK itself, you can message us by texting the word farm, followed by a message to 88440. Louise, another hot week and more harvest results rolling in.
Yeah, we've had quite a few more harvest results coming in. Not that surprising, is it, really, given the weather that we're having? I was talking to one grower yesterday who told me that they had just had the second worst wheat yield they've ever had on their farm. So that was very disappointing for them. And I think that's where the dry conditions and the heat have really taken their toll. That's not the same for everybody, of course. So I don't want to paint a picture that we're having a really dreadful harvest. But it's variable. There are some mixed results. There are some disappointing results. Barley's probably faring a bit better. Winter beans, which is an extraordinary thing to be talking about the winter bean harvest in July, but winter beans are really disappointing growers. So perhaps that's a crop that is just not suited to these extreme weather that we've been having this year. Oilseed rape is doing better, I think. People seem to be much happier with the results that they're getting from that. The only issue or concern there is that it's just getting so dry. So they're having to stop harvesting, or they're having to harvest through the night. And we talked about this a bit last week, didn't we? But yeah, they're really having to make sure that they don't get it in at too low a moisture. So there's just been a bit of disruption to the harvesting of oilseed rape. But the yields are better anyway.
And you talk about adding moisture to grain, Louise, which is something we talked about last week. We have had some feedback on that. Some people saying it can be done, other people saying, it really shouldn't be done. You have got to be careful when you are trying to do it. And speaking of oilseed rape, United Oilseeds have actually put a briefing note out, a guidance note, explaining how best to do it.
Yeah, they have. They've issued some guidance on this, which I'm sure some people will find very useful because, the mills don't want seed in at less than 6% moisture. So they've given the different moisture contents that you might have, so starting at 3% and going up to 6%. And then against each of those values, they have put the litres of water to be added per tonne to raise the moisture level up to 7%. So that's, if you like, some good guidance for people who are really worried about that, so that they make sure they don't either overdo or underdo it. But again, I think they've got to be very careful the way that they do it. But it's good to see that the issue is being recognised and that there is some advice for people who are worried that they're going to get these rejections.
And Hugh, while Louise has been keeping abreast of the latest harvest results, a different and somewhat unusual harvest stories caught your eye.
Oh, this is terrible. Look, so obviously everyone is acutely aware, and there's been plenty, and God forbid it happens to you, of combine fires, bushfires. It's so tinder dry everywhere. But this I noticed on social media, posted by a gentleman called Brian Henman on the Farming UK Facebook feed. This is a buzzard causing a field fire. Basically, what happened is this guy was combining his field and he suddenly heard a massively loud bang. One of the guys there had spotted this buzzard, swooped down onto the power cable, and as opposed to just putting his legs down on the wire, the live wire with no earth, where birds do all the time and it's fine, the poor thing decided to land on one of the insulators, so it touched the insulator and the live wire, so the bird explodes into a bit of a ball of flame, falls onto the ground, and then sets fire to the standing crop. It was just all very unfortunate. For the poor buzzard and for the poor farmer, but thankfully no humans were hurt, and the fire was put out 4 fire tenders later, and obviously many anxious moments, hoping that it didn't spread to any other standing crops.
And Abby, I don't think you can beat that, but you have got an interesting story nonetheless.
Yeah, there's an interesting story about the Church of England and its land portfolio. Basically, they've voted against a plan to rewild 30% of their land by 2030, which is quite interesting. They've come in for some stick, obviously, from environmental organisations for this. A failure to show moral leadership is one of the things that was said. But actually, I think that's quite a questionable judgment. You know, it might be that it's morally right to produce food from the land, and that is actually what they've said in their defence, is that because around 90% of their farmland portfolio is productive or highly productive agricultural land, the focus is on integrating nature recovery into working landscapes, which kind of seems fair enough to me. But, you know, the church does tend to come in for some criticism no matter what it does with its land, much like many other large landowners.
Yeah, the other big thing that's happened recently, Johan, it's actually came out about 10 days or so ago. The Environment Agency did, for the first time, published a report, Agriculture and the Water Environment. Now, this is the first time they've done a big wash-up of all of the sort of stuff around pollution that's involved with agriculture. But the main focus of it actually was talking about the enhanced visits that EA inspectors, as many of us who are farming will know. Most of you listening will have had, if you're farming, will have probably had an EA inspection in the last 4 or 5 years. And they've carried out a huge amount of inspections. And this is really just it's a summing up of what those inspections have found. 48% of those inspections had non-compliances, which, whilst it sounds like a big number, it is a big number. My inspection had a couple of non-compliances, but they were purely paperwork things as opposed to actual physical things going wrong. And many of these are. But that said, you know, we probably need to do better as an industry, particularly when we are seeking for a more common sense, dynamic approach to how we manage water quality and how we integrate that with how we manage our farms. But it's an interesting report, and it's worth a read just to sort of scene set and to get your head around what is actually going on across all of the farms across all of England.
Yeah, something else going on across England this week. Louise, calls for the rural speed limit to be reduced to just 20 miles an hour, something that has already been hotly debated and contested in Wales.
Yes, there's a call to reduce, as you say, the speed limit to 20 miles an hour. And this is to protect cyclists and pedestrians. Now, this has gone down like a lead balloon with people who lead very busy lives. But I think there is another way of looking at this, really. We know that the statistics are horrible. I think it's 2 cyclists lose their lives on the British roads every week. And I do have a bit of a personal perspective on this. As you know, Johan, my eldest son was involved in an accident when he was riding a bicycle, and he was really very badly injured. So after that accident, actually, I had quite a lot of people contact me because my son, his accident took place in London, and as a result, there was CCTV imagery of what happened, and the driver was in fact found guilty. But the people who contacted me after Edward's accident pointed out that they'd had a very similar thing happen to them on a rural road, and there is no CCTV or any other way of showing what did and didn't happen. And as a result, in most of their cases, the drivers just refused to acknowledge that they'd caused a problem or that there had been an accident because there was no proof. So, there are always two ways of looking at an issue like this. And I think it's really important to point out that cyclists are very vulnerable. If they're in a collision, they are either killed or very badly injured. And we don't really want that happening to anybody.
Yeah, I think we all know that feeling of frustration when we're being held up and we're trying to get somewhere important, whether it's to catch a train, the early morning commute, or indeed carting grain to the grain store. But please do take care, slow down and think of others. You might be driving around in a metal box, but there are far more vulnerable road users out there, be it pedestrians, be it equestrians, or indeed cyclists. Right, time for this week's markets. Hugh, what's happening?
Thank you very much, Johan. Finished steer deadweight this week goes back over the £6 mark, so 600.6 pence per kilo. So it's gained a couple of pence in the last week. The live weight gains 5 pence, 348.7. Sheep prices edge back again, probably typical for the time of year, as we know, as all those new season lambs really start to get to market now. Deadweight SQQ this week, 803.7. That's back about 27p on the week, but it's still well ahead. It's 70 odd p ahead of where we were this time last year. The live weight SQQ 385.4, that's actually gone up 1.4 pence in the last week, so that's good. Pig price, not much cheer there. It's edged up by 0.03 of a penny, so it's now 178.73 pence per kilo, the pig SPP. On to the grain markets, and some interesting stuff here, actually. Bits going up and bits going down. So feed wheat's spot this week, as people get tucked into drought-stricken wheat, £174.60, up from £170.50 last week. And just spare a thought for last year. This time last year, feed wheat was £158.80. Milling wheat has gained about 7 or 8 quid on the week, 195.50, up from 187.50. Feed barley's dropped back. Probably because the malting premium's pretty low, as someone said to me this week. Therefore, and with the weather conditions, it's not been easy. 143.60. So that's dropped back £1.10. Oilseed rape has gone forward 4 quid, 428.50. Feed peas 197.5. That drops back 6 quid on the week. Feed beans 219.20. That's up about £1 on the week. And the one thing that is going up, no surprises, it's carried on going up because of all that's going on with the Gulf at the moment. 91.57 is the Wednesday morning ring round for a litre of red diesel. That's up from 81.48 last week. Year ago, that was 20p cheaper this time last year. It was 71.94.
The Farmers Weekly Podcast. The Farmers Weekly Podcast.
And finally, as the search continues for alternative break crops better suited to summer heat waves, 2 farmers are growing field-scale trials of chickpeas. It's not exactly straightforward. Usually found in semi-arid climates, chickpeas in the UK can continue growing into October, causing harvesting and quality issues, as well as disrupting rotations. But David White and John Pawsey hope they can get chickpeas to mature earlier. Louise went along to find out how they're getting on.
So I'm here with grower David White in Cambridgeshire. Also with me is Josiah Meldrum from Hodmedod's. David, it's been a long, hot, dry summer so far. You're growing chickpeas. What's that all about?
Clearly, we've got climate change, and the last 3 springs have been hot and dry, and spring crops in particular on this light land have suffered. And Phil Howell from NIAB said chickpeas will take all the heat that you can throw at them, and clearly that seems to be the case. The problem is with growing chickpeas in the UK traditionally has been cooler, damper summers, not suiting the growth cycle of that crop and them not coming to harvest in a sensible time. So the weather conditions seem to be more suited to the crop now, but with some innovative methods of growing them, i.e. using companion cereal species to synchronise the ripening of the chickpeas with the early ripening cereals seemed to be a logical thing to try with this particular crop, having found that it works really well with oats and beans or beans and barley and other bycrops that I've grown on the farm already. So I'm familiar with the technique and was very happy to trial it to make this crop work.
And looking at the crops here today, I'm thinking that they're really quite close to harvest. When do you envisage that happening?
If the weather continues as it has, and we've just had heat wave 3 and the forecast is for heat wave 4, in 2 weeks' time they're going to be actually very near harvesting, which is sort of a pleasant surprise, because when I went into this, the fear was that it would be a September harvested crop.
And at that stage, Josiah, you come into or Hodmedod's comes into the equation. You're going to be taking these crops, I think. How come you're involved with this?
We've been interested in chickpeas for a long time. We see them as a part of a higher value in terms of the economic return to farm, but also a higher agroecological return to farm because of the benefit they have in a rotation, fixing nitrogen and doing all those fantastic things in the soil. And I think for us, we have worked for almost 15 years with a range of UK grown pulses. But I think the pulse crops that grow best here, the peas and the beans that we're familiar with, are actually the ones that are hardest to market, ironically. The crops that people want us to grow are lentils and chickpeas. We've kind of got there with lentils. Chickpeas have remained challenging for the reasons that David has outlined to do with their ripening and maturity. This year is a freak year. The earliest we've harvested was, I think, 22 when we harvested trial plots in early August. Normally they're late August and early September, if not later. And obviously the trial is all about maturity and evenness of maturity, but it does look like they'll be coming in late July, which is unbelievable.
That's Josiah Meldrum from Hodmedod's, and before him, David White in Cambridgeshire, growing chickpeas as part of a DEFRA-funded Adopt project. Louise, is it really viable to grow chickpeas in the UK, or have David and John just got lucky because of the sort of season we're having this year?
Well, I think the correct answer to that, Johan, is that we just don't know yet. That's why these sorts of projects are so necessary and so interesting, really. This is one of the Adopt funded trials. So it's a farmer-led project. And what they're doing really is looking at whether growing chickpeas in the UK is viable and can be done. So there's still lots to learn, lots that we don't really know, but they are actually growing very, very well on the two farms that are doing this trial. So it was really interesting to go and see them. And of course, I'm going to have to point out, I think, at this stage that we are having an exceptionally hot and dry summer. So the chickpeas, they're just loving it. They can take all the heat that you can throw at them. So they're growing very, very nicely.
So an Adopt project then, and David White isn't, of course, the only person involved.
No, he's not. No, the other farmer involved in this is John Pawsey, who many people know, organic grower in Suffolk. And I think the important thing to sort of point out about chickpeas is that they have this indeterminate growth habit. And that means that if we have a cool, damp summer, that doesn't really suit the crop, because what happens is that they just keep on growing and flowering right into October. And then you get into all sorts of problems with harvesting and rotations and things just not being practical. So part of this work, or most of this work actually, is to look at how we might be able to bring that maturity forward, make it earlier, and get this crop to ripen in time to suit everything else that's going on the farm. So in fact, what both David and John are doing are growing their chickpeas as bycrops. So they've got if you like, companion crops in with them. And the idea behind that is that will synchronise the ripening of the chickpeas with the cereal companion. So in David's case, we saw him growing chickpeas with wheat in there, also with barley and also with oats. And then what he's hoping is that they will, as I say, mature evenly and mature together, these crops. And if you like, bring forward the harvest of the chickpeas. So that's essentially what they're looking at, how they can manipulate that to their advantage and then make them practical for more people to grow.
And Louise, we import a lot of chickpeas, so there's a big domestic market out there, if the numbers stack up, of course.
Yeah, I mean, that's what we've got to look at. I think we import something like 60,000 tonnes of chickpeas into this country. If we can get a reasonable yield from these chickpeas, and we can get the quality, of course, because this is obviously for the human consumption market. So that's an important point as well. Then if we can get the yield, I think these chickpeas have a value of around about £1,000 a tonne. So you don't need huge yields. I think they're expecting to get sort of 1.5 to 2 tonnes per hectare this year. But the potential is, of course, much higher. But as I said at the beginning of this conversation, we've still got a lot to learn about how to grow this crop. And having some funding and having this adopt funding actually is sort of de-risking that process, and meaning that people don't have to be quite as brave as they had to be before to try and grow a crop like this, because there is some insurance behind it. It's very interesting work, and it will be fascinating to see what the results show. If we repeat this again, can we be sure we're going to have another summer as good as this one? Well, say as good as this one in terms of chickpeas anyway.
And well done too, Louise, to Hodmer Whole Foods, a small independent company specialising in grains, pulses and seeds, working with farmers, trying to develop this crop and make it work.
Yeah, I mean, Hodmer are fantastic like that. They've always really worked with their farmers and understood the challenges that are involved with getting crops like this going. So, they've actually been involved with chickpeas, I think, Josiah said, for the last 11 years. And, he'll freely admit that they've had some disasters. But in that time, they have built a knowledge base. There is more now that they understand about chickpeas, and the techniques that they are investigating in this trial, things like intercropping. They're also looking at swathing, actually, to see if that will help ripen the crop. So these techniques, really, really important just to add to the knowledge, understand a bit more about how to grow these things and what the do's and don'ts are, if you like. I think Hodmer would also point out that the route to market is critical with a crop like this, because the last thing you want is some sort of boom and bust scenario, which we have seen before with smaller crops. So yeah, their approach is to be applauded, I think, really. Everybody's learning quite a bit from this, and we'll have to see what the results bring.
We will indeed, and thank you to David White and indeed John Pawsey for opening the farm gate and allowing us in to take a look at what could indeed be an alternative break crop suitable for the UK market. That is it for this episode of this week's Farmers Weekly podcast. We do hope you've enjoyed what you've heard. If you have, as always, please do subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. And if you've really enjoyed what you've heard, please do leave us a 5-star review. We'll be back next week with all the latest news, views and analysis of all the big stories affecting UK agriculture. For now, though, until next week, I'm Johan Tasker.
I'm Louise Impey.
I'm Abby Kay.
And I'm Hugh Broom.
Thank you for listening. This episode of the Farmers Weekly podcast was brought to you by plant breeder KWS, seeding the future since 1856.